Welcome. This is the first of a series of podcasts that Policy Exchange is hosting about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And today we've got Ben Judah with us. He's the Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council and the author of two best-selling relevant books. One called Fragile Empire, which is about the rise and decline of Putin. And the other is called This is London, which is about migration into London, different groups of migrants from rich Russians to poor Roma. And today, the issues we'll be looking at most are one, London at the centre for Russian kleptocrats, for Russian money being sent abroad. And the second aspect is the new refugee crisis from Ukraine and what's going to happen and how that's going to pan out. Ben, you've been very interested for a long time in the role of Russian money in London. Do you think what the government is doing, obviously this has become a key issue since the invasion of Ukraine, and today there's legislation in the Commons which is being pushed through on one day, clamping down on Russian money and some of the oligarchs based in London. Do you think the government's doing enough, and is it finally taken seriously, the sort of issues that you've been concerned about?
Well, I think it's important to kind of begin with talking about what was Londongrad, what was this phenomenon that came to be in the British capital, since the fall of the Soviet Union. And the way I look at it is that there were three components. The first component was London became the most attractive destination for Russian oligarchs, wealthy Russian people, and that consolidated a presence, a community, and then everything that comes with it: influence, operations, networks, a whole kind of sociology of wealthy Russians in town. The second thing that Londongrad was that the City of London and the London Stock Exchange became one of the world's leading venues for the listing of the Russian commodity boom. And if you look at what leading Russian companies were present on the London Stock Exchange, you see things from Polyus Gold to Surgutneftegas to Tatneft to Gazprom and Lukoil. The city became this premier platform for that great Russian boom that really speeds up in the tail end of the 1990s after the Russian default in 1998, crests around 2007, and then, doesn't disappear, remains an important part of the city's finances throughout the last decade. And the third component were the Brits, which is that the British economy, the London economy, had become a premier platform for global services, really, starting off in the very late 1950s, reconfiguring itself after empire for a sort of new world. And they're consolidated a whole series of funds, bankers, accountancy firms that really kind of specialized in servicing Londongrad. So there were three components: the oligarchs and that elite world, the city and the big Russian companies that were listed there, and then the Brits who became their enablers, from the lawyers to the bankers.
And your take is that it's been very detrimental for UK democracy. That it's...
Well, one of the things that I'm thinking about a lot is that we have had a conversation about politics and power in the UK, from the sort of the Blair years onwards, that the city ultimately calls the shots and can protect its interests. And one of the things that's so striking to me is that actually, ultimately, the interests of politics will always come before the interests of the city. And we've seen that in two occasions. First, which is Brexit, and now, which is this bazooka, which has been launched at Londongrad. And even though, we can go on to talk about that, there are a lot of loopholes. A lot of this doesn't go far enough. We haven't built a proper system to deal with it. Unarguably, that the measures the government's taken since this war has broken out have ended an era in which Kremlin-linked finance is going to be a major part of the profits of the City of London and all of those enablers servicing them.
What's your take on the legislation the government is pushing through today?
So if you look at the legislation, it's very important to think, as we do in kind of policy terms, how does it fit into that kind of complex, which is going to actually make sure that this stuff is implemented properly. And when it comes to anti-money laundering, when it comes to economic crimes, there are two components here. The first component is the actual law itself, and then there are the systems. And this legislation is pretty good in terms of getting the legislation, more, better formulated than it was before. But I don't think it goes far enough. There's still a lot of loopholes and a lot of wriggle room and a lot of zones for legal challenge there. The second component is the systems, and we are going to be setting up a register of overseas properties owners with this bill, and again, a lot of loopholes there. But the question is, how is this register going to be enforced? Who's going to be enforcing it? Will they have the numbers to enforce it? And what will the actual system itself look like? One of the things that I've been very concerned about over the last few years in the UK is that on paper, we've got a sort of all right anti-money laundering system. We've got lots of tools, we've got lots of pieces of legislation already on the books, but we're just not really enforcing them. And so the anti-money laundering system in Britain has come to resemble a bit of a hologram in which from a distance it looks real, but actually you can put your hand through it when you get close.
Richard Eakins, who runs the Judicial Power Project for Policy Exchange and is an Oxford constitutional law professor, agrees with you that the legislation doesn't go far enough. He's written a paper for Policy Exchange where he argues that the way ahead should have been an act of Parliament which names specific Russian oligarchs as being sanctioned and then pushes through the sanctions. And his argument for that is that by naming those oligarchs, you reduce the possibility of legal challenges. His concern is, as you've mentioned, the sheer number of lawyers, etc., working for these people mean otherwise the sanctions will be bogged down in legal challenges potentially for years. Is that a concern of yours?
Well, I think that I read the paper and I think the paper's excellent and I agree. But I think that we also need to remember that we have to think politically about what's going on. One of the purposes of these sanctions was in threatening them, we wanted to deter these wealthy and powerful individuals from supporting Putin. In putting them in place, we wanted them to pull Putin back from the brink or push him to the peace table. And I think that a lot of people have sort of forgotten the political purpose of what these sanctions are supposed to be doing right now. So I do have sympathy with the US, UK, and kind of European authorities that are maybe haven't brought the hammer down on one or two specific individuals. It's probably wise for me not to mention, given British libel law, if there is a chance that they could help us in that purpose, if they're trying to play some role in the peace negotiations that has been sort of going on not very successfully, I might add, between Ukraine and Russia. But I think it's important just to think about that when knowing that government hasn't gone after specific people.
And the flip side of that question, how powerful do the oligarchs remain in Russia itself?
What
Can they?
what I don't what I don't think they are is the answer, which is this regime's gone on for a very long time, about almost 23 years, and it's evolved from being a strongman, populist leader in 1999 in a country that was a sort of semi-failing democracy, a bit like Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey, into becoming, after about 2003, 2004, a real sort of classic authoritarian regime, in which kind of some billionaires and businessmen, different with strong government ministers, all have a say around a strong leader. And then what we have now seen is that it's evolved, the final steps being taken under COVID into really a sort of personalist dictatorship where one man is taking decisions alone. And during that journey, what we think of as oligarchs have changed dramatically. We have especially in London, where a lot of these people came to live and they became a presence in our society, our imagination of what Russia is got stuck in the 1990s. The idea that there are these huge, towering, self-made men calling the shots, huge influence in Russian society. That's what Russia was like in, from around 1992 to about 2003, 2004. But it's not like that really anymore. And you can see that is that shortly after what Putin calls a special military operation began in Ukraine, he gathered what was called in the Western press an oligarchs meeting in the Kremlin. And if you looked at the people gathered there, only about sort of 10% of them were what we could think of as oligarchs. The rest of them were state company directors with a FSB, SVR, or KGB past, or they were people created by Putin as placeholders over the commanding heights of the company who owed their positions to him, not the other way around. Like the term oligarch sort of implies independence of will and sort of power, but the oligarchs that we have now in Russia are, for the most part, puppets.
So the sanctioning of the oligarchs, in some ways, if we follow your argument, does more good for Britain than Russia, i.e. it cleans up London rather than actually going to lead to the downfall of Putin.
Exactly. Like if we look at the political science, it's pretty clear that Western sanctions policies do not have a great track record in forcing regime behavior. And if you start to think about what are we likely to achieve here and what are we trying to achieve here, when you're dealing with a country like Russia or you're dealing with a Kremlin that's become a black box, it's very important to put yourself first. And these sanctions are important because they disentangle us from these people. We don't want these people from being in London, building influence networks around them, hiring out our elites, our professional services. We don't want them money laundering in London. Firstly, because it's already illegal when it comes to British law, and because it kind of empowers them and makes them stronger, and it kind of changes us. It degrades our institutions, it degrades our professional ethics, and it does pose kind of questions about our democracy sort of going forward. It does start to undermine it in some very specific places.
From your knowledge of Russia, is there any possibility that Putin will be forced out by whatever forces over the invasion of Ukraine?
I think it's important to think about two things here. One is that COVID is a very important part of this story. When COVID descended, Putin, who no longer behaves like this sort of topless macho man swimming in the rivers in Tuva that he did 10 years ago, but behaves like a very frightened person about his risks of catching this disease, went into an intense personal lockdown, far stricter than any sort of in the world, including that of Xi Jinping. And Putin's been behaving like an intensely immunocompromised person, very frightened of getting COVID. And when this descended, it disrupted the Russian elite's access to him. The meetings they'd had, the daily contact, their ability to kind of talk to him and whisper in his ears was disrupted. And he was in his palaces, essentially with very little contact with them apart from digitally. They had to do extensive quarantines in order to get to him, mostly surrounded by very specific sort of bodyguards. And this, in that context, that was when it was revealed also to them that he'd really truly become this personalist dictator. Now, we don't know, because they don't really know what the exact dynamics of the Kremlin are. But it's very important for us, I think, to realize that it's a black box. But if we want to look at the political science literature on this, it makes extremely depressing reading, which is that once a personalist dictator gathers that much power, he's very unlikely to be pushed out by a democratic revolt. And coups, when they happen, the political science is not really that useful because it's really sort of common sense about when a coup can happen. It's all about palace life. It's all about various things that we're not going to know from the outside. Like, did he get out of bed in the morning? What's the exact state of his health? How have specific people's emotions been triggered by this? It does not seem likely now, but we don't know. Like it could happen in the future.
Thanks. Moving on to migration. You, of course, wrote This is London, which is about how London's been transformed through migration. The migration from Ukraine, by some accounts, is the fastest in history, with 2% of its population leaving in little over 2 weeks. How do you think that will pan out? Will the numbers continue at the current rate, or what do you
Well,
foresee
the
happening?
numbers are truly extraordinary. You've got over 1.5 million refugees leaving Ukraine, pouring into Poland, Romania, Moldova, and Hungary. If the war continues, the number is almost certain to climb. We could see the numbers significantly outstripping the amount of Syrian refugees that reached the EU, not in total yet, even within the next few weeks. This is going to have a profound effect on Ukraine and on Europe for several reasons. I don't believe all these people will go back. The One of the great tragedies is that many Ukrainians will enjoy the kind of European lives that they had hoped for, just not in Ukraine. Like tragedy and loss will have forced them to actually live them in Europe, and it's going to have a major impact on the countries that take them in.
Well, do you think Poland and Hungary will be much more welcoming of them than they were of Syrian refugees, with
Uh,
closer cultural affinities?
Well, absolutely. It's you see Hungary and Poland that fought tooth and nail against a lot of the migration policies and refugee policies of the EU have been leading the charge for Ukrainian refugees' welcome. There's intense cultural affinity that between those countries that have experience of Russian occupation and refugee tragedies in their own past. And one of the things that's going to be really important for the EU to think about is these countries are not the wealthiest of countries and they don't have that much financial room for maneuver. They're going to need a lot of support taking in that many people. If we get to a situation of 1 million refugees in Poland, that's going to put an enormous strain on its budget. Countries like Moldova are already struggling with this when they've only had a couple of tens of thousands of refugees. And that means the EU most likely is probably going to have to press that common debt buzzer that it pressed again when COVID began in order to deal with this momentous shock.
And what about for the UK? Do you think many will come over here, and will we allow a lot of Ukrainians into Britain?
One of the differences is that Ukraine has visa-free access to the EU. So you can just cross the border. Ukrainians don't have visa-free access to the UK, and that's been a source of some kind of controversy and political debate in the UK, which governments come under a lot of fire over. There is precedent that the UK could just. If we look at what happened in Kosovo, the UK took an incredibly generous asylum policy towards that country under Tony Blair. We could take a sort of dramatically generous asylum policy, even just simply presuming that anyone coming from Ukraine is a asylum seeker, kind of inverting that burden of proof, somewhat similar to what happened in 1999. The dynamics of the Conservative Party will really going to tell us whether that's sort of possible or likely. If the UK dropped its visa wall, we could expect large numbers would try and make it to the UK because of its labour market, because of speaking a little bit of basic English, because of the attractions that Britain offers, and also because Britain has demonstrated itself in the eyes of Ukrainians as a sort of one of their leading allies, if not their leading ally.
I suppose there'll be a political fear because in the short term, people see what's going on in Ukraine. Being liberal on asylum will be popular. But in the longer term, I suspect politicians will be fearful that there'll be the same reaction to a large number of Poles arriving in Britain in the Blair years.
Well, I think that those will definitely be the conversations in the Conservative Party if this sort of drags on. I do think that the pressure to admit large numbers of people will grow because I do think that the numbers are going to increase and are already so dramatic. And I do think that every day that this war has gone on, I've been really surprised by the depth of reaction in the in the British public. I'm in favour of taking a more liberal approach on Ukrainian refugees, and I do think that if the Prime Minister chose to pull this trigger, he's actually got a pretty good record on generosity to refugees. If you look at the extraordinary visa offer made to Hong Kong, where if they can sort of prove a link to sort of this sort of BNO status, a sort of link to a sort of formerly held form of British passport in the family, up to 2/3 of the population of Hong Kong can come and settle in the UK and begin a life there. So I do think that Prime Minister has form with such bold and generous offers.
If we're right about the extent of emigration from Ukraine, and let's say worst case scenario happens and Putin takes control of most of the cities, doesn't that mean that Putin's then conquered a country, but he's lost so much of it that it's not much of a victory? If
Well,
all the youth and the people, the productive capacities left the country, or large parts of it, he won't have much to boast about, will he?
I think that the population numbers are likely to be far higher than estimates, because if you look at first Putin's war on Chechnya, depopulation was actually part of the strategy. Like, he wanted rebel Chechens and their families to leave. And numbers are very, very hard to estimate, but a significant percentage of the Chechen population simply left the country. And the Kremlin was very happy about that. Now we look at Putin's dirty war in the Donbass that he's been fighting since 2014. Again, we see in Donetsk and Luhansk the sort of Europeanized, sort of liberal, democratically minded, free-thinking middle class left for the most part. Anybody who felt himself strongly affiliated to Ukraine simply left, and the Kremlin was very happy about that, because that deals with your problem of having to sort of police them or repress them. If Putin moves towards a scenario where it's not clear exactly what he's trying to do. Again, it's not clear even to Russian generals themselves or senior Kremlin officials themselves exactly what he wants. If he does occupy the major cities to the east of the Dnieper River, such as Kharkiv or Chernigov, I believe it's highly likely that he will want the pro-Ukrainian population simply to leave, and will be happy for them to move westward. One of the things that we're seeing currently in Kiev is there's been some speculation about why the Russians have not surrounded the city, or why they're sort of going slow. Kiev, by reports from journalists on the ground, already looks pretty much half uninhabited. And that it makes complete sense if you're a Russian commander or a Russian general who wants as many people to leave as possible before launching an assault on the city.
So depopulation is actually part of Russia's policy in.
Russia has been extremely happy to let that happen in Chechnya and in Donbass, because it makes those places much easier to control. I don't have access to a specific document or a specific, in which it's sort of written down, that's the strategy. But I think we can infer that that's something that they're very happy to see happen. And again, like, if one wants to look at the kind of history that Putin's been reading and that Putin's been thinking about, one of the things we know about Putin is that he basically only reads history books and spends his time like poring over these books about the czars and the leaders of the Soviet Union almost as user manuals. Is that large-scale population movements were a key part of how Stalin consolidated control over Eastern Europe, or indeed Western Ukraine.
Yeah, exactly, Ukraine.
Exactly. So I would expect, and I definitely think that Britain and its allies should be preparing for really momentous population movements out of the territory that Putin occupies.